Welcome to the video edition of The Fourth Curtain, featuring this week's interview. Catch the extended audio version with Alex and Aaron's commentary wherever you get your podcasts. On with the show.
Buckle up, listeners, because today's guest is an absolute juggernaut of storytelling. With a career spanning books, comics, games, he has a PhD. And get this, he's a Jeopardy champion. So, folks, we know he's smart. He's fresh off of writing for Marvel Rivals. If you've played that, Aaron, have you played that?
Yeah, it's fantastic.
It's really
I sent it to all the artists I'm working with, and I was like, load this up, look at it. That's like the first thing I did.
No, wait. Yeah. You're supposed to say you loaded up and sent it all to all of our writers and said, "Check out this dialogue."
I'm on the art team.
Yes, worked on some of the most iconic franchises: Marvel, DC, Transformers, Halo. I didn't know all the Halo stuff you had done until I started doing a little bit of research. D&D. Yeah, I Love Bees. We had Jordan Weissman on a little while ago. So I'm guessing you probably worked with Jordan and Alon Lee. Also wrote a couple of graphic novel stories in the Halo universe. And it's none other than I didn't even say your name yet. Aaron, you want to guess who it is? It's Alex Irvine. Thank you for being here, Alex. So great to have you on the show. How are you?
It's great to be here. Thanks. I'm feeling fine. It's a sunny day here, and I got nothing to complain about.
Where are you in Maine?
I live in Maine. Yeah.
Oh, nice. You're like close to Stephen King. Is that where all the writers live?
Yeah, he's about 2 hours up the road.
Okay.
Maine's a pretty big state.
Yeah, for an eastern state, it is. There's something I learned shortly after I moved here was that you can fit all 5 of the other New England states in Maine. And but Maine is, if you compare it to states west of the Mississippi, it's still pretty tiny.
I guess it looks big because it's on that part of the projection.
Yeah, it's also distorted. More Maine trivia. We'll kick this off. Maine is the only state with a 1-syllable name. And it is also the only state that only borders one other state.
Oh.
So we are cut off. If you want to get out of Maine, you have to go through New Hampshire.
And then it's the ocean in Canada, huh?
Right. Yeah.
Wait, does it connect to Canada? It does.
Nova
Scotia?
Yeah. Okay. Nova Scotia and Quebec. Or actually New Brunswick. I think it's the direct connections are to New Brunswick. You have to go through New Brunswick to get to Nova Scotia.
Okay, so what is it, like 4 degrees outside?
It was, I think when I started my car this morning, it was 12. But and we're about to get a cold snap. So
that's pre-cold snap.
Yeah. It's chilly right now, but
it's the appetizer.
It's going to get actually cold next week. Although we're going to get a warm snap before that. It's going to get up into the 40s briefly and rain for a minute, and then get really cold.
Oh, wow.
Huh. All right. Well, we didn't invite you here to talk about the weather.
This is we do. That's not good. We got nothing else to talk about.
No.
Yeah.
But so maybe let's talk about Marvel Rivals. Like that's your most recent
press
project. How was that, and how does I'm always fascinated by the different kinds of game structures and how narrative is deployed. Like coming from, I got my start by working on basically single player campaign games where it's pretty linear and you can write a story. Sometimes you do gameplay first and you have all these ideas about setting, and then you try to develop the story that goes through it. But for a game like Rivals, like how is narrative actually built?
Yeah, it's it can be tricky. I mean, every game is different. You guys know that every game you have to go through that sort of narrative design and imagination phase where you figure out, like, where does the story belong in this game? How is the game going to deliver the story? How's the story going to interact with the gameplay? So with Rivals, it was the same thing. But even before all that happened, there was a lot of world building and backstory to be created, because the whole story of the time stream entanglement and the first appearances of Chronovium and which different maps and areas and realms we're going to end up in the game, and which we're going to just kind of stay in the backstories. We worked on all that stuff for probably close to a year, and then while the programmers and the gameplay engineers and the artists were all off doing their own thing too. Excuse me. And so there's a whole lot of lore in the game that that as you're playing it, you don't run across much of it, except for much of it is what's there is told primarily in two ways in game, and that is through the locations themselves. What you see. There's an environmental storytelling aspect to all that. And so when you're in Tokyo, this is not the Tokyo that you could actually get on an airplane and fly to, right? And then there's and then the dialogue in a game like Rivals, where the gameplay is so fast, and there's not a lot of cutscenes where people stand around and talk about what the next quest is going to be. Then and there's not a lot of NPC conversations and things like that. You have to deliver story and character mostly through occasional dialogue, and so it's a matter of deciding which characters do you want to have occasional dialogue with each other, and how are those character pairings going to be fruitful? Are they going to convey a lot of lore? Are they just going to be bantering for the purpose of snappy banter during combat because that's fun? And so all this thinking is happening kind of behind the scenes, and then we're making choices about what kinds of character work the players are going to encounter while they're playing, and what kinds of lore they are going to encounter like between missions, when you see the stories on the character cards and the other background stuff that comes out. That was a long-winded answer.
No, that was awesome.
No, that's good. It's like it's so pieced out, There's like little story bits everywhere.
Yeah.
I love the world building stuff.
Yeah.
How does that go with a partner like Marvel, where this is fitting into, it's like perhaps from their perspective, it's one piece to a bigger puzzle.
Yeah, that's always an interesting thing working with Marvel, because when I first started working on Marvel games, there was this idea that they were going to create like a Marvel gaming universe that was going to exist in the same way that the MCU
that sounds
does.
familiar. That sounds familiar.
You'll know something about that, and it never really happened, as you also know.
That also sounds familiar.
Wait, did you two work together on that?
When I was at Disney, that was that was my initiative. Was, hey, let's tie these games together. It was pre MCU.
Yeah,
but it didn't get funded.
Well, that was it was so frustrating, because we came up with all these great ideas about how to do it, and then I was coming out of ARGs at that point, and thinking, like, wouldn't it be cool if we had some ARG aspects that we could, there would be a place where players could go that all the games touched, and we could move them back and forth from game to game. We could link in comics. We could loop in anything. We could do original stuff. And then, as Alex said, it didn't get funded. But so we made a bunch of games. So even back then, we were trying to figure out, like, if there's going to be this MCU, like, how's it different from the comics? How is it different from the movies? How are we going to decide if it stays consistent? And I think some of those questions got complex enough that there were people at Disney that didn't really want to deal with them, right? And not you, Alex, but
Alex is like, I ain't got time for this, man.
But then, so all the other Marvel games I worked on, it's a similar thing. You have to decide, like, what relationship does this particular game universe have to the MCU or to the comics? Is it trying to incorporate elements of both? If so, what do you do when they're contradictory? Which one do you choose? And what if that breaks something else somewhere else in your story? And it's a real tap dance in some of these games, especially as they get big, kind of sprawly stories. Like when I was working on Avengers Alliance, that was our first game that we were doing. I worked on that game for 6 years. And over that time, there were a lot of story points where, we had to decide what were we going to be consistent with. was it going to be the comics, or was it going to be with this new movie stuff, or was it going to be with stuff we'd already done in the game? And did we have to figure out a way to retcon that or tap dance around it? And so with Rivals, it was kind of the same thing. And there was our get out of jail free card was basically the time stream entanglement. Like there was the original idea of the game when I was brought on was just that they wanted lots of different locations that would be sort of interesting. And one of the things they came to me for was like a story mechanic that would make that happen. And so and there was this, and they wanted Dr. Doom involved for sure. And so we went back and forth and kicked various ideas around, and then I came up with this idea that like what if Doom was trying to master time the way that he is always trying to master space, and so he comes up with a machine, and this crazy machine, and then he accidentally breaks time, and what happens is in the act of doing that, all these different time streams kind of overlap and scramble each other. And I had this idea that this would all happen in one geographic place. Like you'd be walking down the street, and all of a sudden you would snap from universe to universe. But there's
and the programmer said, "Whoa, wait a second. That's too many lines of code."
Yeah. Ideas are free, but actually making them isn't. And so they came up with more practical ideas that still incorporated all the cool stuff about the time stream entanglement. And then
how long was that? How long were you on the project? How long were you on the project?
Oh, I worked on Rivals for about 4 years.
Okay.
And
that's a long time. Yeah.
It was. There was a lot of world building to do and all that kind of stuff. And then I wrote a ton of dialogue and then lots of backstories and I came up with. There was NetEase was coming up with location ideas, and I was coming up with location ideas, and Marvel had some location ideas, and we scrambled them all together and came up with the.
What's that like work life like? It's like 4 years. I imagine it's kind of in fits and spurts a little bit, or is it just 4 years heads down? I'm just cranking stuff out every day.
Well, so Rivals was like the fourth game I had done that was with Marvel and NetEase, and so they sort of tended to overlap in some interesting ways. Like I started working on the first one and I got pretty buried in that for a while, and then as that one was getting sort of mature and ready to go, they were like, "Oh, here's this other game," and so I was working on that one, and so as one would wind down, another one would ramp up, and Rivals came along as some other stuff was winding down, and so early on, there was a period of time when I started working on Rivals where I was actually I was working on 4 different Marvel and NetEase games at once. And
wait, which were the other ones?
Marvel Duel. One of them hasn't been released yet, I don't think. And the problem with asking me what these games are called is that we called them by their project code names for so long that I actually but one of them is Duel. One of them is not War of Heroes. That was years ago.
That's cool.
I almost want to stop and look this up, but I don't want to break up the conversation.
We got an editor.
Yeah. It's someone will know. But it was codename Chima. No, that was a different one. Yeah, see, we call these games code names forever, and then at the last second they get named, and then I'm supposed to remember the name. And
we have the same. But so you had like four projects, Marvel and NetEase, that you're working on, so that's kind of keeping you pretty occupied throughout that period of time.
Yeah, for a while, Danny Koo was joking that I was NetEase's Marvel staff writer, and so.
Danny, how's Danny doing?
Well, last I knew, he's doing pretty well. Yeah, he's
good.
He's a good guy.
So Danny Koo was at Disney with us back in the day, and he's at Marvel, right?
Yeah.
So he's part of Marvel now.
Yeah. Yep, and he's doing some music, and in addition to overseeing lots of game projects and everything, so he's a cool cat.
Right on. Okay, so and with the whole time stream did that kind of get started with the Loki TV show? Or does that kind of go back to like older parts of the comic canon that it kind of got resurrected for this
Spider-Verse
iteration of the
Yeah,
universe.
yeah. Marvel has always had fun with different universes, but they've usually kept most of them in bubbles and separate from the main 616 continuity. Um, and then when the MCU really started leaning into multiverse stuff, that I think freed up people to think about multiverse stuff a different way in the games. Um, and the fun thing about Rivals was we didn't just say, okay, we're going to do the Ultimates universe here, we're going to do zombies here, we're going to do this other stuff here. We were taking locations and saying, okay, let's make them different. Let's make this different from anything that we've seen before. And so it felt almost like the multiverse stuff that was happening in the movies and occasionally in the comics too, with the whole incursion storylines and all that. That like created the space, but then when we stepped into the space, we could do a bunch of different things, which was really fun. There's some great locations that are still coming, and I'll be excited for people to see them. And then there are a bunch of other ones that I don't know if they'll ever get made, but they're awesome anyway.
Do you work with the environment team on the story stuff? Like, there's storytelling inside the level? Like, is there like a...
early on, yeah. Usually what happens is we talk early on about like, what we need, what we would like this level to accomplish. I mean, they know what they want it to do gameplay wise, what kind of missions they want to have there and things like that. But then if there's story stuff that I'm hoping will get accomplished, then we talk about that early on. And then after those early conversations, it's usually pretty much out of my hands after that, because it's all designers and artists and gameplay engineers and whatnot who take it over from there.
Okay, right on. All right. Well, here's a different sort of kind of question for you, which is I'm sort of curious how
the PhD.
No. Well, no. I guess PhD. Maybe as part of it is on one end of it, which is like where do writers come from? It's like when did you realize that Alex, maybe you were eggs? When did you realize you were good at it? Like how did somebody encourage you? Were you always like when I was like, I don't know what I was doing, adding numbers in my head, and Aaron was doodling in the side of his notebook. Were you just like moving letters around on the fridge? You're like, I made a word. It's like where do writers? Yeah, how did that happen for you?
Well, it's I mean, I read very early as a kid. I could read before I was 3, and
that's young. That's young for reading.
Yeah.
That's young. Yeah.
It
is young. Yeah.
Yeah, that's very young.
Can your kids read, Aaron? Can they all read?
This morning I was doing the week, like Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. Yeah, I was doing that, and she's 2.
Yeah.
So, and she's almost 3. So
yeah.
And
I mean, I wasn't reading like, philosophy and stuff when I was 3, but I could, I could sound out words and stuff like that. And so I've just always loved to read. I was one of those kids who sit there reading the back of a cereal box while I'm, eating Raisin Bran. And my parents were readers, and they, told us stories. And so I just grew up like all soaked in stories. And I think another critical stage of my development came when I was about 7. And my dad brought home this little box. It was about 6 by 9, cream colored, and it said Dungeons and Dragons on the box. And opened it up, and there were these little parchment books, and you could look. And so he taught me how to play D&D with him and all of his hippie friends. And so they'd sit around. We had this giant oak table in the dining room of the house we were living in then, and they would all sit around the table and smoke weed and listen to Steve Miller and play D&D, and I would sit there at the edge of the table, watching it, and
okay,
and then And then one day they let me roll up a character, and I started playing. And
did you say roll up a character?
Yeah,
What?
So to speak.
No.
And I still have
where
those
was
books.
this?
This was in Ypsilanti, Michigan, which is where I grew up mostly.
Okay, right on.
Yeah, right next door to Ann Arbor.
Good. Good on your dad for getting you into D&D.
Yeah, and it was great. So I immediately started like drawing up dungeons and coming up with adventures. And so when this group of kids, we kind of accreted, like Stardust or something, and then we started playing D&D. I was always the DM, and so I got a lot of storytelling in that way. And then high school came along, and I read somewhere that girls like poetry, and so I started writing poems. And it turned out the girls did like poetry, so this is great.
Cool.
And so, and then all this stuff kind of came together. And then when I was in college, I started fooling around with writing a little bit, but not too much, because I was so involved in theater at the time. And then
were you acting in theater?
Theater
or writing?
Yeah. When I started college, I went to the University of Michigan to study aerospace engineering, and I did that for about a year and a half. And I remember
adjacent for sure.
Yeah. I mean, it's a natural.
Different.
Well, I went to do this because when I was a kid, I wanted to be an astronaut, and then I had glasses, and you couldn't be an astronaut if you had glasses. And so then I said to myself, well, if I can't fly spaceships, I'll build them. And so I went to college for aerospace. And then I was sitting in a fluid dynamics class early my sophomore year, and I was modeling a wing. And I remember saying to myself, I had this like Paul on the road to Damascus, scales fell from my eyes kind of like, oh shit moment. And I said to myself, I'm never going to build spaceships. I'm going to model this wing for the rest of my life. And it was this vision was awful. And I was already doing plays and everything. I had started doing theater and stuff late in high school, so I left the engineering school, and then I like hopscotched through like 5 or 6 different majors in the liberal arts school in Michigan. I was German for a minute, and English for a minute, and anthropology for a minute, and then I landed in theater, and that was where I got my degree. Did a bunch of plays, did 30 some plays while I was in college, I think, because Michigan at that time, it's a big and really prominent theater and musical theater program, and it did some musicals too. But it also had this little black box theater in the basement of this old building where the theater department was. And every year, student groups could sign up to use it. So there were 14 weeks in a semester, and so there were 14 sign-up periods. And so you got a week of rehearsal time, and then the weekend to put on your show. You could do anything you wanted, and they gave you like $100 to buy props. So we did all kinds of crazy plays down there. And then, and then after college, I did some touring theater and some commercials and whatnot. And then I moved to Colorado because I had a friend out there, and I didn't want to go to LA. I wasn't ready, to just like make a jump to a place like LA. And I remember thinking one day while I was sitting on the porch of my place I was living in Boulder, I was like, plays are cool. Maybe I'll try to write one. And so I wrote a couple of plays, and they were terrible. And but the writing thing, I was like, this is fun. I like this writing thing, and because it was harkening back to like all D&D storytelling and all this stuff.
Yep.
And so I started trying to write short stories.
What year is this?
This is 1992.
So this is when short stories were like a thing, right?
Yeah, they still are.
Yeah,
I still write lots of short stories. Yeah. I mean, I like to think so anyway, because I still like to write them.
Wait, this is 92, and this is post-college, or you're?
Yeah, I graduated in 91.
Ah, me too. Okay,
all right.
We're the same age.
I'm thinking about like there was like an era
you
where
look younger than me.
I think we look about the same age.
Oh, you look really good.
You look great.
What about me? So
You
hey,
look
so
terrific.
Aaron just got a new web camera. He's very excited about it.
Oh.
No, I'm not. I want to talk about the short story thing because I remember in 91, 92, there was like a vibe where there was like sci-fi magazines you could get that had like, it was just short stories. There were a lot of book, like you'd go to the grocery store and Stephen King was writing just books with short stories in it.
Yeah.
It felt like a vibe in the air.
Yeah. I mean, and those magazines were where I broke in, where I first started publishing. And
what was your first published work?
If you don't count college magazines, it was a story called Rossetti Song in FNSF, the magazine of fantasy and science fiction.
Yeah. Okay.
That was that story came out in 2000. I wrote it in 98. So I had.
Do you remember like holding it in your hands, published? And was that a thing? We're like, oh shit, look at this.
Yeah. When you get your 3
that's
copies,
awesome.
it was before everything was digital. I mean, I think I still have copies of that magazine. Landmarks like that, milestones, you don't want to let go of them. But I mean, I started seriously trying to write in 93. I heard about this workshop called Clarion that a lot of science fiction writers had gone to. And I had been fooling around with short stories, not really finishing anything. And I was like, okay, well, I'll apply to Clarion. And you needed to send 2 short stories to apply to Clarion. And so I sat down, and I was late because I found out about it when the registration deadline or the application deadline was like in 3 days or something. And so I sat down with my typewriter and ripped out 2 short stories. Yeah, I didn't have a computer at the time. And sent off these 2 short stories that I had written basically in one day and overnight. And I got in. So I went to Clarion and met some cool writers there and one thing that Clarion does is, if you're a guy like me who didn't really grow up around writers, it introduces you to the idea that writers are actually just people, and that maybe you can do this. It's not some kind of sorcery. It's just a thing that people do. So then I started seriously trying to write, and I put stuff in the mail for 5 years before anybody bought anything, and then it was the year after that, 2 years after that I sold my first novel.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's awesome. We hear that kind of thing a lot, that like things are made by people. And when you're young or you haven't done that thing before, that's actually a revelation that
it is. It totally is.
Like, that thing that I like, I could, somebody did that. I could do that. It's like, that's actually a pretty important revelation.
And the persistence thing too.
Yeah.
5 years not getting picked up. And then like some people give up month 2,
Yeah, they do. And when I was teaching, I used to tell my students this all the time. I was like, just keep at it. Just keep at it. Eventually, somebody told me once, and I wish I remembered who it was so I could give them credit. He told me to be a successful writer, there are 3 qualities to be a successful writer: talent, persistence, and luck. You need 2 of them, any 2. And that makes a lot of sense to me, actually. Because if you have persistence and luck, eventually you're going to catch a break somewhere, even if you're not especially talented. If you have talent and persistence, eventually you'll get there. If you have talent and luck, then geez, you don't need persistence because everything's going to fall into your lap.
I thought you were going to say there are a lot of talentless writers out there, right?
Well, I mean, who am I to judge?
Well,
everybody's out there doing their best.
Well, apparently you can solve the formula without talent, so maybe.
Yeah, that was my
maybe.
That was the case.
No. Wait. So, what was your first novel?
My first novel was called A Scattering of Jades. It's a kind of a secret history with monsters. It was, excuse me. It won a couple of horror awards when it came out, which surprised me because I hadn't thought about it as a horror novel, but I guess it was. It's a story about P.T. Barnum and Aztec mythology and slavery and New York in the 1830s and 40s. So
just a couple themes.
Cool mix.
Yeah. I mean, everybody does that, I know, but that was the first one, and And you want another persistent story? I started writing this book in '93, right after I got home from Clarion, because I went to that workshop in the summer of '93, and I sent it off. I had some advice. Like at that time, you didn't send whole novel manuscripts off. And I think a lot of people still don't want you to. But I wrote, basically you wrote 3 chapters in an outline and a cover letter boasting about all the kinds of stuff that you've never actually done, and then you send it off to a publisher and hope. And so I had met this editor at a convention, and so I sent it to him, and he kept stringing me along for like ever. And then I found out that he'd actually left the publisher. And so I called somebody else there and tried to find out like what was going on with my book. And they were like, "Oh, we'll get somebody else to read it." And I said, "Terrific." And another like 6 months or whatever went by. And by this time I was already in grad school. And right when I was supposed to be working on my master's thesis, I got a call from this publisher, this new editor. And she said, "Hey, I read your partial. I'd really love to see the rest of the book." The problem was I hadn't written the rest of the book, right? Because I'm in grad school.
You're like, oh shit!
Yeah, so you wrote the whole thing that night.
I was like, "All right, give me a minute," and I wrote the rest of the book in like 3 or 4 months while I was also finishing my master's thesis, and sent it off to her, and she was like, "Great," and then she left. And the book ended up in a corner again. And I moved. I was in Maine. I was in Maine at this time. I was in grad school at the University of Maine getting my master's, and then went out to Colorado to get a PhD. And so after I got all settled in Colorado, I got in contact with the publisher again, and I said, "Hey, so what about my book?" And they were like, "Oh, sorry. Send us another copy. I'll make sure it gets decent attention and all this." And so and I did that for another 3 years with different editors. And then I finished all my PhD coursework and came back east because my wife at the time was from Massachusetts. And so I was at this convention in Boston. And I was at this party at this convention and got talking to this guy who was an editor at this same publisher. And I said, "Buddy, have I got a story for you?" And I told him the whole story. And he said, "That's awful. Send me another copy of the book, and I promise you that I'll at least get you an answer." I said, "Okay." So for like the 5th time, I sent off a copy of this book to the same publisher. I'm sure that there's still copies of it everywhere in their office, I'm sure. And
like everyone's reading it. That's
yeah, I know. And so that was February, and in August or early September, he called me up and bought it. And so, which was amazing.
What's the moral there? What's the lesson?
Yeah, the moral here
for the listener.
It like to me, the lesson was, stay the course, because it took me, the first person who ever read that book all the way through bought it, but it took me 6 years to get someone to read it all the way through.
Yeah.
And so this is the same with short stories. In the end, I put them in the mail forever, and then eventually someone bought one, and then I was off and running after that. But yeah,
okay. I think if you reverse engineer the formula, that's talent and persistence. There wasn't luck there.
I don't feel like I had a lot. Of luck. Yeah,
it was all 3 because you were at the convention talking to the guy.
Yeah, I mean there is that, and actually to tease that out a little bit more, the reason he was interested in talking to me is because I mentioned that I had just published a short story in FNSF. That was the first story that I was mentioning, and so that first story unlocked a conversation with this editor that led somebody to finally read the freaking novel that I've been sending to him for like 6 years, and it all came together.
Yeah. That's yes, I like Aaron. I could feel the anxiety.
I was having anxiety as he's telling it. I'm like, oh my god.
So you get a PhD, and what was your PhD was in what?
English. There's a story there too, but I did all my PhD coursework mostly in medieval and Renaissance stuff with a side of postmodernism, and then but I was going to do a dissertation on Philip K. Dick, and so I had
right
all lined up and everything. I did my master's thesis on him too, on information theory and a couple of his novels, and so then I was actually working on my dissertation when I got that call that I had sold a novel. And I was like, oh, so do I finish my dis or do I write another novel? So I wrote another novel, and things went from there. And I was, writing novels and doing this and doing that. And I was actually working at a newspaper, an all weekly here in Portland. And I found out that that University of Maine was hiring a creative writing professor, which was where I'd gotten my master's degree. And I was like, it'd be nice to go back up there. So I applied for the job and I got it, contingent on finishing my PhD. And I was like, oh no, I have to finish my PhD this summer. And there was no way to do this original dissertation idea that I'd had before in like the 4 months between when I got the offer and when I would have had to start. So I called up University of Denver, which is where I had done all my PhD coursework, and I was like, so here's my situation. And they said, well, we do have a creative dissertation option. They never would let me do it before, but they didn't want to stop me from getting a job, So I put together a creative disc committee, and it was great. The writers at DU really helped me a lot. Bryen Evanson was one, and Laird Hunt. They were great, and so that was how I got. And so I wrote a creative dissertation, which was a short story collection, basically, to come back what we're talking about here, and more short story collections. And then I had to do like an introduction that was kind of my, theory of fiction. And that was my dissertation. And then I taught at University of Maine for 6 years, and then pulled the plug to write full time. So
cool.
Cool.
So you did a master's studies on Philip K. Dick.
Well, my master's degree was also mostly on Renaissance stuff, but I really wanted to write about Phil Dick, and so I just had to find somebody on the faculty who would let me do it. And so there's this one professor, Naomi Jacobs, who had done a lot of work on utopian stuff, and I thought, she'll work with science fiction, right? And she hadn't read Phil Dick, so I gave her a bunch of books. And
I was going to ask, recommend what's your favorite Dick book?
Oh,
I know that's a funny sentence to say, but
I didn't even think about that. Dirty Minds.
I
just read Ubik.
I love Ubik. Ubik is great. The bit with the coins, so good. And those, I stole the thing he does where there's the little advertising slogans as the headers for every chapter. I've borrowed that a couple of times. And
that's called
Ubik would be top
inspiration.
5. Yeah. I can give you top 5 probably. I can't give you
top 5.
Ubik
Here we go.
One.
Top 5.
Valis, I think is a brilliant, brave, frightening book. And one of the last ones he wrote before he died. Man in the High Castle, obviously, even though I don't really love the TV series. Let's see, Martian Time Slip, which was the book that I mostly wrote my master's thesis on.
Martian Time Slip. I haven't read that.
Yeah, it's a good one. It's you can really tell that Dick was a Faulkner fan when you read it, because there are huge bits of Martian Time Slip that read like bits from Sound and the Fury. And then probably the Three Stigmata of Palmer Eldritch. So I guess I'm going to land really hard on the 60s Phil Dick stuff.
Dude, you didn't say any of the ones I've read. I literally have not read any one of those. No.
Well, Do Androids Dream is a great one too.
Yeah, that's the one.
That
would
be
the first one.
Yeah.
All right. I'm putting Martian Time Slip on my reading list. Thank you. I appreciate that.
You can get the best of.
All right. Well, so how did you connect? How did you start writing for video games and for Marvel? Like, was there a gateway here that from, original like novels and things like that to working with sort of IP and games?
Yeah.
And
well, so working with Marvel, I had a novel coming out, and so I was in New York doing a reading at KGB, which I don't know if you know it. It's this bar that has several different reading series, and one of them is a science fiction reading series. And I've read there a few times over the years, and so I was doing this reading, and then after the reading, a friend of my editors said, hey, there's a buddy of mine who works at Marvel. He's at a bar across the street. Let's go say hi to him. And I went and said hi to him. And we got to talking, and he said, hey, have you ever thought about writing comics? And I said, as a matter of fact, yes, I have thought about writing comics. And that led to me writing some comics for Marvel. So that was cool. And then not too long after that, I got an email from Mark Laidlaw, who's the famous game writer. But I knew Mark through science fiction conventions and science fiction because we've been in some of the same magazines, and I'd see him at a convention once in a while. I didn't even know he wrote games. So Mark said, you've done some work for Marvel, right? And at that time I had written a few comics for Marvel, and he knew I'd worked on ARGs. And so he said, I got this buddy who is working on a Marvel game, and he needs a writer. And do you want me to put you in touch with him? And I was like, sure. I'll have that conversation. And that was and that's how I got introduced to Cha Chin Lee and ended up working on Avengers Alliance, which at the time was called Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. But then the TV show came out and they had to change the name. So that's
the first comics. What were the first comics you worked on?
The first comic I did was a Hellstorm miniseries. Marvel had this adult Max imprint, and it struck me that a character like Damon Hellstrom was perfect for a Max book. So I wrote like this super gory Hellstorm horror book set in New Orleans right after Katrina. Yeah, it's also
was this
about
before or after the Disney acquisition of Marvel? This was before.
This was before.
Right.
The Disney acquisition was what, in 2010?
2009.
Okay, 9, yeah.
I think end of 2009. It was the first day I walked into Disney as an employee. My first day was the day they announced closed the
How about
acquisition. That? Yeah, I know.
Oh, wow.
Weird, huh?
Yeah.
So you were working with folks out of New York?
Yeah, my first editor there was Axel Alonso, who was later editor-in-chief, and then he left and he started his own comic company. But I did, with Axel, I did that Max book, and then I did Daredevil Noir.
How was that different? Like, what was that like different? Like for you writing for comics versus, writing a novel or short story? Like,
well, the big difference is that it's collaborative. And when you're writing a novel or a short story, it's just you banging your head against your notebook or the keyboard until you either figure it out or just abandon the story and go off and write something else. But with a comic, comic scripts are interesting in that what you're writing is like a recipe for someone else to help make. And so you have to figure out, you got a story you want to tell, but you also have to tell it in such a way that your artist partner can then join in, and the two of you together can figure out how to make the script into an actual comic. And that's that process is a learning curve. It takes a minute to figure it out. Like,
do you have to like think visually, like as you're writing, like, hey,
sure,
I'm writing for an image, I'm writing for a scene.
Yeah. And the thing that is really hard to keep in mind for a lot of people starting writing comics is that each panel in a comic is a frozen moment in time. So it's the stop motion storytelling, right? And the time only passes in the gutters between panels. There are ways to fake that. You can do like diptychs and have like overlaid images and stuff like that. People try to flex that in different ways, but by and large, each panel is a single moment in time. And so you have to think really carefully about how you pace that and which moments you want to select, and then what you want them to look like. And then the flip side of that is you don't want to give too much art direction, because then your artist gets all irritated and it's like, get up, leave me alone. I'll give you an example of this on the Daredevil book. So it's Daredevil in Prohibition era New York. It's just like alternate Daredevil.
I know that one.
Oh, do you?
Yeah.
I had fun writing that book. There's a big stagey fight scene where Daredevil takes out a bunch of the Kingpin's goons in this brewery, this illicit brewery. And I choreographed this beautifully in my mind. And so I wrote this long scripted panel descriptions for this double-page splash that would have all this stuff in it. And my phone rings, and it's the artist, this guy Tom Coker. He's a great artist, and we've worked on other stuff together too since then. But he was like, yeah, so I'm reading through the script, and a lot of times when there's a scene like this one in the brewery here. A writer will just write, they fight.
Subtle.
And I shrank. I shrank on the phone. And I was like, okay. That was an educational moment for me. And so ever since then, I've tried to, be real conscious about the amount of art direction I'm giving when I'm writing a comic.
Focus on the dialogue.
Yeah, and just choose the moments, right? Because but then leave the artist alone to figure out what they're going to look like on the page.
That's cool.
And how did you get connected with I Love Bees?
Well, so at the same science fiction convention where
going to conventions really pays off, huh?
Yeah. Especially small ones in science fiction. Comic conventions have also done me a lot of good, but only the big ones. I've never really gone to any small ones. But when I was first starting out, you went to conventions just to talk to people, and you can't be constantly on the make because that turns people off, right? But if you're at a science fiction convention and you love these books and these stories, then you're just talking to a bunch of other people who also love these books and these stories. And then, the conversations go places, and then you send them a story and you're a face. You're not just a name on a piece of paper.
Yeah.
And so the World Fantasy Convention in 1998 was in Monterey, California. And I had been corresponding with this novelist named Sean Stewart. And Sean lived in Monterey at the time, and he said, why don't you come out for World Fantasy? You can crash at my house. And so I came out, and he was great. And that was the convention where I sold my first short story to FNSF. I almost did, because the editor was looking for me the whole time at the convention to tell me this, but I never actually saw him in person. But everybody told me. But when I did talk to him afterwards, he was like, I was gonna tell you. So I would have. But so Sean and I were friends after that, and then Sean, because I think because through some other connection that Sean had, he started working with Jordan and Ilan on The Beast, the first ARG that
right.
he did. I think the term ARG was coined to describe The Beast, actually.
Yeah, and that was for the movie AI, right?
Yeah,
Spielberg,
yeah.
Kubrick movie, yeah.
And so Sean pretty quickly figured out that it was more than one guy could write, and so he called a couple of people to come in and be the writing team, and I was one of them. And so we worked on The Beast, which was an awesome and also utterly insane experience. And then
what was the insane part?
I could tell a lot of stories, but so we spent all this time building all these fake websites, because you guys know that's how the game worked. It was delivered through fake websites, and then there was this rabbit hole that was one line on the movie poster said "Sentient Machine Therapist Janine Sala," and some sharp-eyed people who saw the movie poster were like, "Sentient Machine Therapist," and somebody looked up Janine Sala, and once you did that, you were down the rabbit hole into the game. And so there are all these fake websites, and then if you looked at the source code, there was puzzles you could solve through these websites that would lead you to different ones and unlock all this different stuff, and different elements of the story. And it was supposed to be all staged out over time. And so we got all this stuff written, and then we and pressed send, and we were like, okay, that's great. Now we got a couple of weeks to relax and write other stuff, because it's going to take whoever reads this and plays this game like weeks to solve all these puzzles, which the players immediately formed into these hive mind groups and solved all the puzzles in, like, it was something like 18 hours. And and so then there was this period where the game became like live theater, man. Like every time a new thing went live, we had to figure out, like, how fast were they going to solve it, and how were we going to fix it if they solved it too fast, and what were we going to have ready. And so, I mean, there was this one time I got a call from, I can't remember if it was from Sean or from Pete Fenlon, who's a game designer who worked on all kinds of video and tabletop stuff. but it was midnight, and either Sean or Pete said, okay, we need a website for a hat shop in Pittsburgh during the game time frame, like 2140 or whatever. And we need pointers to this and that. And here's going to be the nature of the puzzle. So we need you to write part of that. It's got to go live at 2. So I was like, okay. And so that's what this game was like for the first, few weeks after it launched. Until we started to figure out the rhythm of how the players solve stuff, and until we started making some figuring out other ways to pace out the new parts of the story and everything. And then it was after that it was just a really cool exploration of like this new way of storytelling.
Yeah. Well, it's really interesting cool. Where it's very much, that was very much, I don't know. I got to imagine when you guys were making that, you had no idea if it was going to work. Mm-hmm. B, like, hey, what order are people going to find things in? Like, how do you tell this? Like, how do you tell a story where you have no control over how it's actually consumed? I mean, you basically just have to like world build, like out on the web.
Yeah, you put all this stuff out there, and then you figure, they're going to find it all, and obviously they're going to find it all a lot faster than we thought they would. And so then you have to gate it in a certain way by, I think one thing was figuring out that we really had to, and you see this more in I Love Bees, you have to be rigorous about how you let people unlock things, and so when we were working on I Love Bees, the first thing, Sean calls me up and he was like, so here's what we're going to do. Here's this next thing that we're going to do. And do you want in? I was like, yeah. And so the big pre-production thing for I Love Bees was all of us there were like 4 or 5 of us writers working on it. And we all had to go out and call everybody we knew and get them to go walk around their neighborhoods and find payphones that would accept incoming calls. This is a different era, right? Like, I mean, ask somebody to do that now, and I mean,
okay, kids, there used to be these things called payphones, like a landline just on the corner.
Yeah. You put a quarter in it, you can talk to somebody. And so I was like, I was emailing my mom's old friends in Australia and people everywhere, and so we got all these phone numbers. And so one of the ways that the game narrative was delivered there was through this radio play.
Dude, I love that play. I would listen to it. I had it on my Zune.
Did you really?
Yeah, and I would just like, they were all out of
Zune.
I had a Zune, a Halo Zune, dude. What was awesome is no one could figure out the order of them, and it didn't really matter what order you listened to them in. I loved it. It was so good.
That's awesome to hear. Yeah, I had a blast writing it. It's
so good.
Yeah, and so, did you ever do the payphone thing?
No, I was reading other people would do it, and you would hear what they would write out their experience and
So what would happen was when you solve some puzzles, one of the solutions would be a set of latitude and longitude coordinates and a time, and if you got to a payphone at that time and you had a password, then you would unlock part of this radio play. And as soon as I think 5 people did it in the real world, it would go live online, and other people could listen to it and download it and whatever else.
Oh, okay, cool.
That's the way I remember it. This is 20 years ago, so I might not have all the details exactly right.
You can find people have uploaded it and have like their
you can still find most of the Beast. Like, it's hosted on the Cloudmakers website. That was the big
cool.
fan.
I didn't know that.
But then people got Alex. This is back to your question of how do you know whether people are going to like it or want to do it. There was this one time where there's a hurricane coming in Florida, and so of course one of our puzzle solutions, was this payphone somewhere in Florida at this exact time when the hurricane is bearing down. And sure enough, some guy solves the puzzle and is standing out there in the middle of the hurricane at a payphone, like screaming the password into the payphone. And I think what happened was that the actor who was supposed to be on the other side actually broke and said, "Dude, you have to go home. You're going to die." And anyway, he survived, and the game was, and that section of the radio play was released, and the whole thing went on. But those were such a blast to work on. They were my first game experiences, and so it was for them. It was all about like exploring, like, how do we do this? Nobody's done this before, and how does it work? And it was so great. I loved working on those.
That's super cool. I obviously love that it actually happened, but just like its own kind of medium, it's like,
yeah.
And I don't think people aren't really doing that so much anymore.
Not in the same way. I mean, there was a while Sean went on and became a partner in this company called 42 Entertainment. And Elon, and I think Jordan was involved in that too.
Yeah.
And they did all kinds of stuff. And now Sean is he's at another company that does some similar things. So like a lot of the stuff that people learned from ARGs has now been exported into other different kinds of hybrid creative marketing things. But I haven't really kept up on the space. So it'd be interesting to go back.
We have our community manager, Doug Zartman, who's was in and around those projects, runs a small ARG on our Discord.
Fun.
Yeah, so
that's
cool. You should come on over and check it out.
I will.
Listeners, you should come on over and check it out. There's a little plug for our Discord.
Did you work on the 9 Inch Nails one that was after the I Love Beans?
I didn't work on that one. No, but Sean mostly did that one.
Yeah.
Aaron, are you a big fan
of the ARGs?
No,
or 9 Inch Nails.
9 Inch Nails, yeah.
I know you're a big fan. What's next? What's coming up next for you, Alex?
Oh, well, I've been working on a game that is not announced yet that I hope will come out someday. I spent last year and a half or so also working on that. And I've been writing a lot of fiction again. And so there's I'm in this weird spot where, Rivals came out and everything else I'm doing is either in super early unannounced stages or it's my own personal stuff that I'm kind of fiddling around with. So no big marketing bombshells at the moment, but yeah, I'm writing like crazy. It's been one of the things that happens when you stop working on a project that's as big as Rivals is that all these other things that have been building up in the back of your mind, like they all went out at once, and so so I've been trying to catch up on all this stuff that I have not been writing for the last 5 years, and or just trying to. It's like drinking from a fire hose. So
that sounds like a good thing. Is that a good thing? Do you like that where it's kind of like, okay, that big huge thing, I'm done with that now. I can kind of explore all this other stuff that's been
it's great. I mean, and that said, I'd be happy if another big thing came along because it's nice to get like really stuck into something and really get into it for a while. But it's nice to be working on stuff that I've been wanting to work on for a while. Like that, this past fall I finished this kind of all ages graphic novel called Pocket Guide to Space Monsters, and so we'll see what happens with that. I have high hopes for it, and then working on a couple other books, and then maybe some other game projects. So all kinds of stuff.
Are you still playing D&D?
Yes, I play D&D with my kids and my brother-in-law.
Are you the DM?
Matt, my brother-in-law always wants to DM, so so I get to just play, which is fun.
Yeah. I was going to ask if you guys are all smoking weed, but
no. Rolling up new characters.
That's an expression, Aaron. But even I mean, like every time I think of D&D, honestly, I associate D&D with like oak, because that's what the table was made out of, and the sound of Steve Miller and weed smoke. Those are my sense memories. My sense memories of D&D.
Okay, all right. Two out of the three there, I'm with you on, and you can just
don't tell me which two.
Imagine
he's allergic to oak.
That's right.
I'm a woodworker, so
all right.
All right, Alex. Thank you so much for hanging out with us.
Thanks for having me. I really enjoyed this conversation.
Yeah, no, it's awesome. And man, we should get a chance to work together sometime.
I hope we do.
Super cool.
Yeah. Let's make it happen.
That'd be awesome. Yeah. All right. Well, good luck with your projects that you're coming up with next, and we'll see you around.
Yes, you will.
Thanks, guys. Alex. Nice meeting you.
Take it easy.
Thank you for listening to the Fourth Curtain Podcast. Visit us at thefourthcurtain.com to find our monthly newsletter and support the show via Patreon. The Fourth Curtain Podcast is a production of Fourth Curtain Media. Lovingly edited by Bryen Hensley of Noise Floor Sound Solutions. Production support by May Lee with community management by Doug Zartman and art production by Paul Russell. Thanks again for listening.